Good morning and welcome. You're watching Market Cafe on ET Now. I am Harsh Saita and with me is Ankita Saxena. Good morning, Ankita.
Good morning, Harsh.
So after a listless day of trade on Monday, at least that's how I would describe it for Indian markets. They opened positive but closed very weak is probably the way I would sum it up. How are global markets, Ankita? How should one look at the global markets? Because that's probably the only tailwind that can give Indian markets a little bit of a boost today.
Unfortunately, Harsh, even the global markets are pretty directionless right now, with US markets being shut yesterday. The US markets were closed yesterday due to the President's Day holiday. Even the stock futures are right now in the red. They're down. Dow Jones is down 120 points, S&P 500 down 0.4%, and Nasdaq is down 0.3% as of now. Now, retail giants Walmart and Home Depot are slated to report their earnings, and investors are really looking ahead to the Fed's minutes that will be released on Wednesday, which is tomorrow. That's an important thing that the whole world is really watching out for. And the European markets closed slightly higher on Monday after a choppy day of trading, with attention this week set to be on the publication of Federal Reserve's meeting notes. The Pan-European Stock 600 index moved between slight losses and gains throughout the session. It closed up just 0.1% higher. DAX was down, marginally down. It was in the red, but largely flat. FTSE was up 0.1% and CAC was down 0.1%. So not much of a direction coming in from the European markets. Pretty mixed there, Harsh. What is the crude looking like?
Well, yes. Before I get to crude, we can look at the SGX Nifty as well, flat as it can possibly be, just 4 points higher at the moment, 0.03% higher to start at least today's show. So we're seeing largely flat on the indices, not much of a direction, but quickly moving on to crude. Crude has climbed a little bit. It's 1% higher in early trade today. It's at around $77 a barrel, which is where WTI is. Let's look at Brent as well. Brent is roughly just below that $84 a barrel mark. The losses of last week, crude just about trying to make up for that, but really not able to completely make up for that. So that's where we're at crude. Definitely positive for the emerging markets basket, because crude hasn't really spiked despite all the news that's come through, despite even a possible supply cut by Russia. So across the board, despite that, as well as of course the Chinese demand recovering, and despite that, crude's not really recovered in a meaningful fashion. That's definitely a positive for India, as well as inflation in India. That's how I'd currently look at crude. Ankita, take us through all the events that we need to look out for in trade today.
Right, Harsh. Now, of course, we have already spoken about the Fed's minute that is due to release tomorrow. Very important minutes this time because of the mixed cues and the inflation data that's been coming out of the US. Now, as of today, we need to watch out for global earnings of HSBC, Wilmar International, Walmart, and Home Depot. We also have back home, we have Heritage Foods that will approve the basis of allotment of shares, and Ujjain SFB that will have a meeting on the declaration of interim dividends. Also, it is the last day to be eligible for dividends for Balrampur Chini, Bosch, Cochin Shipyard, IRCTC, Oil India, and Torrent Power. So these are the events that you need to watch out for in today's trading session.
Well, yes, Ankita, but on a somber note on the geopolitics side, another earthquake struck the border region of Turkey and Syria just 2 weeks after the area was devastated by a larger quake that killed more than 47,000 people. The earthquake killed 3 people and injured 200 people thus far. There were 32 aftershocks following Monday's tremor, and the largest of them had a magnitude of 5.8.
And weeks of dry winter weather have raised concerns that Italy could face another drought after last year's emergency. The warning comes as Venice faces unusually low tides that are making it impossible for water taxis and ambulances to navigate some of its famous canals. Italian rivers and lakes are also suffering from severe lack of water. Italy's longest river, Po, had suffered its worst drought for 70 years last July.
And switching on to China markets, Goldman Sachs strategists see an economic shift from reopening to recovery, driving Chinese stocks as much as 24% higher by the end of this year. The firm sees a potential 24% upside to the MSCI China index. The country is moving past the reopening that followed its stringent zero-COVID policies to a growth phase. Chinese stocks entered bull market territory around the Lunar New Year earlier this year. The MSCI China index peaked at the end of January, up nearly 60% from the low seen in October.
And Sri Lanka's Election Commission has instructed its lawyers to inform the Supreme Court about a lack of funds. The local body polls are due on March 9th. The Commission also regretted that they were unable to keep to an earlier assurance given by the court that all arrangements would be in place to conduct the election.
Well, and North Korea has fired 2 ballistic missiles towards the East Sea. This is the second such attack within 48 hours, and it has been fired a day after the US and South Korea staged joint air drills. However, North Korean leader's sister Kim Yo-jong warned of corresponding counteraction to US-South Korean joint military drills. She said that the frequency of using the Pacific Ocean as their testing ground will depend on the nature of US actions. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has condemned North Korea's actions and called on them to cease provocative action.
And streets have submerged near the Brazilian coast due to flooding. According to the reports, at least 36 people have been killed in Sao Paulo. Reports also say that many houses were swept away due to the storms. According to the officials, the situation remains extremely critical in Brazil.
Well, and US President Joe Biden made a surprise visit to Ukraine with days to go before the first anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. The US President has challenged Russia's policy from the Ukrainian soil, promising more military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Now, US President Joe Biden also spoke about the Russia-Ukraine tensions. Let's listen in.
The world was literally at the time bracing for the fall of Kyiv. Seems like a lot longer ago than a year, but think back to that year. Perhaps even the end of Ukraine. You know, 1 year later, Kyiv stands, and Ukraine stands. Democracy stands. The Americans stand with you, and the world stands with you. Kyiv has captured a part of my heart, I must say.
And well, we'll stay with that news. And you know, how has Russia been doing on the war front? Does it have the same kind of support that the Ukrainians have? Here's an ET Now explainer on it. Let's take a look.
The Russia-Ukraine war, it's just days away from marking 1 year since the actual conflict began. The war continues to remain in this volatile phase, and there is no clear path to peace. The US President Joe Biden has made that surprise visit to the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv to assure the country's president of the American solidarity, and this as it deals with an aggressive enemy. But how has Russia been doing on its count? Does it have the same kind of support that the Ukrainians have? And that's what we're here to explain. Now, Joe Biden's secret and surprise visit to Ukraine, that is being seen as a show of support for Ukraine. Having the world's strongest military power and its allies has actually helped Ukraine from ceding to Russia. Experts have suggested that Russia may have miscalculated the defense put up by Ukraine and that it has suffered huge casualties in its invasion. These numbers that we are now running on our screens, it's obvious that the war needs to end. While most of Russia's traditional allies have called for the conflict to end, China, as reports are suggesting, is allegedly helping Russia through non-lethal means. And now the US claims that China could also be moving to help Russia with lethal support. I expressed deep concerns about the possibility that China will provide lethal material support to Russia. To date, we have seen Chinese companies provide non-lethal support to Russia for use in Ukraine. The concern that we have now is based on information we have that they are considering providing lethal support, is what we got from Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State. So now, the question is, what kind of non-lethal support has China offered Russia? So far, China's support for Russia has been political. China has helped prevent efforts to condemn Moscow at the United Nations. Like India, it continues to buy oil from Russia, which the West claims helps Russia fund its war chest. But the Chinese forces, unlike India, have participated in joint military operations along with the Russian army. So, what could happen if China continues to support Russia? US-China relations already have been at their worst in decades. The Americans have tried to limit the latest microprocessors and manufacturing equipment to China to challenge its territorial claims in Taiwan. The US has also sanctioned several social media platforms and apps, and those are related to the Chinese Communist Party, and they've put strictures on them. Now, if the US continues to sanction Chinese entities, China could be emboldened to launch a Russian-style military operation in Taiwan, something the world just cannot afford at the moment. And this is what makes the Russia-Ukraine war such a volatile one. And with no clear path to peace, it could be a real dangerous proposition for other conflicts as well.
Well, thanks for that, as always, Vikram. Always insightful to hear him break down things. And with that, we'll slip into a very short break, of course. More on the other side, we'll switch to domestic. Welcome back. You're watching Market Cafe on ET Now. We'll switch over. Domestic news is what we're currently focusing on. Speaking at a post-budget meeting, the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said that the government and the RBI was monitoring inflation closely and said it would take any steps required to keep it under check. The Finance Minister also said this was an issue with most emerging economies and that the government was equipped to handle inflation. This comes after headline retail inflation for the month of January came in above the RBI's upper tolerance limit, back above, if I can say, 6.5% was where it was at. This was despite a series of repo rate hikes undertaken by the Indian Central Bank. Let's listen in to what the Finance Minister has to say.
Inflation control के लिए मैंने budget reply के द्वारा एक नहीं बहुत सारे कदम जो केंद्र सरकार ने उठाया उसको लिस्ट आउट किया. उसमें मैं इस उदाहरण के लिए 3-4 आपके सामने रख रही हूँ. बहुत सारे स्टेप्स हमने उठाया. शायद पिछले 12 वीक्स और 24 वीक्स में, वो मैं करेक्ट करना चाहती हूँ, 24 वीक्स सबसे लोवेस्ट लेवल में आया है WPI. सो इन्फ्लेशन कंट्रोल के लिए बहुत सारे कदम सरकार उठा रही है और कंटिन्यूअस उसमें ध्यान देते रहेंगे.
And we will stay with those inflationary concerns, and we've got a couple of experts to weigh in on inflation and decode the roadmap for us. Let's take a look.
Well, it is the fact that exports have already slowed down. We saw that in the data for the previous month, where we saw the trade data saying exports contracting quite substantially. And it is the fact that India cannot remain an island of prosperity when the whole world is going through a slowdown. So it will impact us definitely. Yes, it is true that we are better off than many of our peers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're in a good position vis-a-vis the rest of the world entirely. Because the fact is that we are living in a globalized world, and whatever happens abroad does impact us, whether it is in terms of the slowdown in demand from the West, also in terms of the hiking of interest rates in the West. Both will affect us. So I think we are in for fairly tough times. Yes, not as bad as in our neighborhood, whether it is Pakistan or Sri Lanka, but certainly things could have been better if the external environment were also better. Unfortunately, it's not. So we'll have to kind of, live through that. 7% is not our maximum potential. We could grow faster if we had done things better, particularly if the RBI had caught on to inflation and had not missed the bus. It was behind the curve like many central banks. But the fact is that other central banks being behind the curve does not justify our Reserve Bank of India being behind the curve.
I mean, I would say that, I am in the camp that we are going to see a recession in the US, irrespective of what's happening now, because the expectations are again building up that Fed will have to raise rates. Now, the more the Fed raises rates, as I have said for a few weeks now, the more precarious it makes the US economy. Let's not forget, even if people who are talking about the retail sales number, year-on-year growth of 6%, that's nominal number, right? So on real terms, if you take 6% inflation, the real increase actually has been flat. And if you look at other stats I'd like to point out is housing starts. Housing starts have been falling for 9 months in a row. And if you go back and look in history, most of such long streaks have ended in a recession.
Right, and we'll stick with rather the banking sector. Speaking at a conference, Uday Kotak believes it is important for India to be current account surplus. He also expects India to achieve 6% real GDP growth in FY24. He further encourages government to focus on capex spending and sees stronger bank credit growth at around 1.5 times of nominal GDP, which is projected to grow at 11%. So he's expecting good banks to grow in the within the mid-teens bracket.
And with that, it's time for us to slip into a short break. You don't go anywhere. There's lots more news coming up.
Right, welcome back. You're watching Market Cafe on ET Now. Let's quickly take a look at what Asian markets are up to in early trade today. We're looking at cuts on the ASX 200, which is down around 0.4%. The Nikkei is absolutely flat, as you saw it. We're looking, though, at a little bit of positive, a little bit of green on the Kospi, which is the Korean index. So it's a mixed day of trade already to start off with. The Kospi is up around 0.1%. The Hang Seng is down around 0.5%, and the Shanghai index is up in the green 0.25%. So it's a mixed bag at the moment, the way we see it. And we're looking at the SGX Nifty, which is absolutely flat, down, up rather, around 0.1%. So slight positive bias on the SGX at the moment. But mind you, after yesterday's weakness, it looks like another weak day of trade, at least to start off with. But we'll quickly move on. Ankita, what do we have?
So now we have what is lined up for the market. Let's quickly take you through the Power Pack lineup that we have for you. At 9:20, we have Shadri Sen, Head of Research, Alchemy Capital Management, on his view of the D Street. And at 9:35, we have Vinay Sharma of Nippon India, who will be talking to us about whether the bank's growth has really peaked out.
Right, and we'll have Lisa join us in the studio. Lisa is going to take us through all the stocks and news as she always does. Lisa.
Yes, a couple of fundraising plans have been announced by companies, starting with JK Tyre. They have announced a fundraising plan of around 240 crore, and that will be through issuance of convertible debentures. So they have entered into an agreement with International Finance Corporation, and it will be converted into equity shares at a conversion price of around 180.5 per share. BPCL is also planning to raise up to 1,500 crore during FY23, and that will be through issuance of NCDs. NHPC also has raised around 996 crore through issuance of NCDs, which are AD series bonds, and they are at 7.59% interest rates. So GR Infra Projects has also has been allotted as L1 bidder for 2 projects, and they have emerged. The project 1 is worth around 1,875 crore for the development of a ropeway from Gaurikund to Kedarnath, and the project 2 is around 1,738 crore for the development of ropeway from Govind Ghat to Gangaria. And lastly, on Asian Paints, they have entered into an MOU with the government of Gujarat for the manufacturing setup of vinyl acetate ethylene emulsion and VAM at Dahej in Gujarat. So these are the stocks that investors will keep on focus for today.
Well, thank you for that, Lisa. Do keep an eye out on all those stocks, but you also have the brokerage notes that came in this morning. Take us through that as well.
Right, Ankita. So, Citi has come out with a report on Marico. They say that the revenue and earnings growth is likely to be at the higher end, and they expect uptake across Marico's business segments starting from Q4 onwards, and they see improving trends across the core brands such as Saffola as well as Parachute. They believe that there is a room for the stock's valuation gap versus the peer to narrow, and most importantly, they have opened a 90-day catalyst watch, which is positive for Marico. Moving on to JP Morgan, they have maintained an overweight on Power Grid at a target price of 250 per share. They say that the pickup in transmission awards that has led to a potential upside to the capex guidance, and also India's large transmission plan to integrate renewables that sees an uptick, or that sees a probability of an uptick in the capex guidance. And lastly, Morgan Stanley has also maintained an overweight on Bharti Airtel at a target price of 860 per share. They say that Bharti has rolled out higher minimum recharge plans across 2 more circles, and Morgan Stanley is of the view that these plans could eventually be rolled across pan-India. Well, these are on Brokerage Radar for today.
Right, thanks so much for that download, Lisa. We'll keep all of those stocks on our radar. But quickly moving on, we had Vikash Prasad, who's the portfolio manager, Asia Equities, manages billions of dollars, and he believes that India's healthcare story is pretty much intact and that India's earnings growth story is very, very strong as well. Let's listen in to his views.
The Indian healthcare story is still intact, very strong. If you look at hospitals, services, some pockets of biotech and pharma, I agree with the view on diagnostics. If you look at IT services, the larger companies, it's not as bad as people think. If you listen to the commentary, if you look at the numbers, revenues are healthier than people thought. Margins are higher than people thought they would be. Banks is one area where we prefer some of the smaller and middle-sized ones, specialty finance, housing finance, not so much the big banks. The scale is such, you have to be more careful. Autos have surprised me, four-wheeler and now two-wheelers. I think those are fertile grounds for long-term investors. We can keep going, there's a lot to talk about. Yeah. But I think the point is that if you look over the past 2 decades, there have been so many episodes where you have gotten these questions, I have gotten these questions. If you think about May 2004, May 2009, when the election results were surprising. 2013, the summer, yield curve inverting, currency blowing out, same questions. Global financial crisis, COVID. But the market endures because the earnings growth story is so strong. There are other markets where there's a short-term trade. This is not one of them. This is perhaps the longest dated trade in the world when it comes to equities, and we're here to be a part of that. Aggregate exposure to the class of 21, class of 22 tech IPOs is still effectively zero. You can have an issue with a company's valuation or the business model itself. For us, for many of these companies, the issue was not the valuation, although it was that also. The primary concern was the business model itself. And in a world of rising competition, pricier capital, what do these companies do? How do they evolve? And what we've seen in the earnings delivery, or there's not much earnings, even in the revenue delivery, is that our concerns have been justified. And despite the correction in the share price, there's not much value there yet. So there's a small subset of these companies that we keep our eye on, but our aggregate exposure is still effectively zero. In areas, in B2B e-commerce, in infrastructure build-out, in manufacturing, and in two-wheelers, where we are actually quite excited. Our allocation to new private companies in 2022 was zero. And this year, however, we're making progress, we're doing diligence. It's another reason why I'm here, to meet some of these companies. And I think that story in particular is very exciting, but there's a broader story around that of manufacturing in India that we can talk about. That is very exciting. And so yes, if I look at what could be the class of maybe 2024 or class of 2025 IPOs, the companies that we're looking at today are very exciting, and there's a high probability that we allocate capital there.
And well, moving on, Minda Corp has acquired 15% stake in Precor for 400 crore rupees in an open market cash transaction amid speculations of a hostile takeover. Let's listen into what the Minda Corp management had to say about this issue.
As you all are aware that Minda Corporation has purchased 15.7% equity in Precol for a cumulative amount of 400 crores through on-market transactions on 17 February 2023. The shares of Precol are purchased solely for the investment of the surplus funds available with the company. There is a board mandate to deploy cash, and this is the best use of the funds after evaluating various opportunities over a period of time. We have analyzed the performance of Precol over a period of time and observed that it has a significant potential for growth. Minda Corporation investment in Precol is through market purchases constituting a minority stake, and this investment does not grant any special rights. Minda Corporation will continue to focus on its consistent, sustainable and market-beating performance.
Right, and we'll switch over. The RBI has done a great job. We'll switch the story. UPI of India and Pay Now of Singapore will be linked to enable faster and cost-efficient transfer of cross-border remittances. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong would virtually witness the launch of cross-border connectivity. Sharad, my colleague, joins in to give us more details on this one.
Well, yes, it's a very proud moment actually for India, and then now this UPI is going global. That's the emerging theme happening. But now let's focus on today's 11 a.m. meeting, and this is a very important meeting because now between India and Singapore, there'll be cross-border connectivity. Now that means that basically you can send UPI payments and receive payments while doing the transactions across both the countries. Now, do remember there is a recent buzz also coming in the UPI segment. RuPay made its first credit card for UPI transactions. Recently, PhonePe also announced with MobiKwik that they would allow, and it would be the first fintech, however, to allow the UPI payments by Indians who are going abroad. NCPI also stated that NRIs from almost 10 countries can do the transactions, and a lot of other news coming in, especially Ebix Cash also supporting and being the first company to launch UPI for foreign nationals while they travel in India. And lastly, Paytm also, in Q3 numbers, they reported that UPI payments went up 34% if you include the UPI incentives going ahead. Now, this is a very important trigger happening overall in the UPI ecosystem. And let's look at the total value transactions, and that has been also building up very nicely, and so currently at 7.5 lakh crore rupees, and February has not ended yet. And January, that amount touched to 13 lakh crore rupees as per the NCPI data. And lastly, if you look at the UPI contribution in the total digital payments, that stands at around 52% as per the economic survey. But the question remains is what is next for UPI? And two important triggers are there. The first one being India pitching for a stronger digital payment system, especially amongst the G20 members. So that is something which we'll be watching out for. And lastly would be the pricing regulation and how they deal with the fintech players.
Well, that's very interesting, Sharad. Thank you so much for that lowdown. And we'll quickly move on now. The RBI has done a great job in supporting the economy and working with the policymakers, says Neural Rubini in an exclusive chat. But he adds that more rate hikes could be warranted if inflation persists. Let's take a look.
So far, I think the RBI has done well. They thought that they probably were done with the last policy hike, 25 basis points in February. Unfortunately, the data about headline inflation and core since then have come slightly higher than expected, even if wholesale inflation is lower. There is a state of the world in which, unfortunately, inflationary pressure may be persisting, and therefore the RBI might be forced to hike slightly more and withdraw further liquidity if the world is a weaker one. And if the world is going to be one which will be financial pressure on the currency, on the balance of payment and so on, then the policy trade-offs are going to be challenging, because either you prevent the currency by essentially weakening by doing forex intervention that has cost and benefits, or you let the currency weaken. If it weakens too much, that may be a source of imported inflation, or you hike essentially policy rates in a way that weakens economic growth. I think that you have to manage it carefully. I would say that the margin, while the currency has weakened on a number of measures, say the real exchange rate equilibrium, probably there is still room for some depreciation, especially if you're thinking about having export-led growth, either of manufacturing or also of services. So a gradually falling currency may not lead to significant imported inflation, especially because some of your raw material like oil and energy from Russia is bought at not international market prices but discounted prices. And the benefit of having a slightly weaker currency, like in the case of the Asian tiger, might outperform any kind of concerns about imported inflation. So maintaining a competitive currency should be actually one of the important objectives of the RBI.
Talking of currency, we are also trying to conduct international trade with a lot of partners across the world in our own currency, be it Russia, Iran, Africa, parts of Southeast Asia. Do you see that gain momentum?
Yeah, you know, I'm on the view that overall there will be a process of de-dollarization over time. Part of it is just structural. The share of global economy of the U.S. is falling from 40 to 20%. Doesn't make sense for the U.S. dollar to be 2/3 of all international financial and trade transactions.
Right, and we'll quickly cut through to News Fatafat, which is our last segment. Wipro has slashed the annual salary offers of freshers by 50% after promising them a high pay. Wipro will now only be able to pay annual packages of 3.5 lakhs to freshers, whereas the company had initially promised to pay an annual package of 6.5 lakhs to fresh candidates. Also, a sharp spike has been reported in adenovirus cases amongst children in West Bengal. The virus was detected in at least 32% of samples of respiratory infections among children. At the ICMR and ICED, 2 die of suspected virus.
And India enters in the Women's T20 World Cup semi-finals, beating against Ireland by 5 runs. Meanwhile, Indian captain Harmanpreet praised Mandana for her crucial role in the victory.
Well, with that, we're completely out of time on this edition of Market Cafe. Thank you so much for watching. From me, Ankita, as well as the whole team that puts the show together. Thanks for watching.